Night has a way of settling over a neighborhood like a heavy blanket, soft enough to feel familiar but thick enough to hide the edges of things. In most places, the world grows quieter after dark porch lights flick on, curtains are drawn, and the glow from a living room lamp becomes the only sign that someone is still awake. It's a peaceful kind of stillness, the kind that lets you hear the low hum of an appliance or the distant whir of a passing car. From inside a warm room, the windows turn into mirrors, reflecting small details of your own life while the outside fades into a gentle blur. It's easy to forget how thin that glass really is. But sometimes, in the calmest hours of the night, you catch something that doesn't fit: a flicker of movement in the pane, a dark shape where the yard should be empty, or the faint sense that something outside is just a little too still. It never feels alarming at first. It feels like a mistake your eyes made, something you saw out of the corner of your vision that disappears the moment you look directly at it. Yet the longer you sit alone with the house settling and the wind brushing against the siding, the more you notice the spaces beyond the glass. The shadows look deeper. The silence stretches longer. And the reflection in the window stops feeling like the only thing staring back. That's when the unease begins, not loud, not urgent, but quiet in a way that makes your pulse slow down instead of speed up. You start to wonder what the darkness outside looks like from the other side of the glass, and whether something out there has been watching longer than you realized. And tonight we're going to step into those moments, the ones that happen between the safety of home and the thin, cold world just beyond the window pane. I used to spend most evenings at my small apartment desk, the one tucked right beneath the window that overlooked the courtyard. It wasn't much of a view: a couple of old trees, a row of parked cars, and a flickering light on the far side that the landlord never bothered fixing, but it was familiar. Comforting, even. At night the courtyard grew quiet, and the window turned into more of a soft mirror, catching the warm glow of my desk lamp and the faint steam from my mug. I liked that hour between midnight and 1, when the building settled into a kind of gentle silence, and the only sounds were the hum of the fridge and the whisper of cars passing blocks away. It felt safe in a way that made studying, reading, or simply sitting there feel peaceful. I never thought much about the darkness beyond the glass. The first time it happened, I barely reacted. I was typing something, half lost in my work, when I saw a faint shape in the reflection that didn't match anything in the room. It looked like the blurred outline of a person, not detailed, just a soft suggestion of a head and shoulders behind me. I turned around instantly, expecting to see maybe a coat hanging strangely or the shadow of the hallway light. But the room was exactly as it should be: empty, still. I laughed at myself, rubbed my eyes, and blamed it on long hours and tired vision. When I looked back at the screen, the reflection showed only me and the lamp, nothing else. I didn't think about it again for days. A week later, it happened again. This time it was clearer, not enough to see features, but enough to see that the shape was standing where no shadow should be, slightly behind my right shoulder, just out of focus. I felt a quick cold drop in my stomach, the kind you get when you miss a step on the stairs. I turned around quickly, heart tapping a little faster, but the apartment was empty. Even so, the air felt different, like it carried a faint chill that hadn't been there moments before. I stood slowly, checking the hallway, the bathroom, even the kitchen, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But when I returned to the desk, my hands shook slightly when I grabbed the chair. Something about seeing that shape twice in the same spot made the room feel a little less like mine. Over the next several nights, the shape appeared more frequently, always in the reflection, always behind me, and always with that faint, wrong stillness that made my skin prickle the moment I noticed it. Sometimes it would appear for only a heartbeat, a flicker just off to the side, gone the moment I shifted my weight. Other times it lingered just long enough for me to notice the height, the tilt of what looked like a head, the suggestion of something leaning forward as though watching what I was doing. I began adjusting the lamp to eliminate glare, pulling the curtain halfway, even moving my desk a few inches. Yet no matter what angle or lighting I chose, the reflection found a way to catch that same hazy shape. One night, frustration pushed me to sit there longer than usual, determined not to keep jumping at shadows. I stared at the glass instead of my screen, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness outside. It was colder that night, and a thin layer of condensation was forming on the pane. I wiped it with my sleeve and leaned closer to study the reflection. For a moment, it was just me, tired eyes, slightly messy hair, the warm glow of the lamp behind me. But slowly, as the room grew still, a dark patch began to form in the reflection. It wasn't a shadow from inside, it was too defined, too intentional. And this time, it wasn't behind me, it was outside. A face. Not pressed to the glass, not fully visible, but unmistakable, the pale suggestion of cheeks, the faint curve of a mouth, the dark hollows where eyes should be. It wasn't clear enough to describe, but it was clear enough to know it was watching. I froze, breath held so tightly my chest ached. My first instinct was to turn on every light, to grab my phone, to do anything that would shatter the moment. But I couldn't move. I just stared at that barely there face staring right back at me through the window's reflection. When I finally turned around slowly, terrified, the window itself looked empty. Just darkness, the courtyard, and the flickering light on the far end. No face, no figure, nothing close enough to account for what I'd seen. I stood so abruptly my chair tipped over. My hands were cold and numb when I touched the curtain and yanked it across the glass. For the rest of the night, I sat on the couch with the TV on low, every creak in the building making my pulse jump. From then on, I avoided the window entirely after dark. I'd close the curtain tight before the sun set, and if I needed to work late, I'd move to the kitchen table. But sometimes, even with the curtain drawn, I felt a strange sensation, like someone was standing just on the other side of it, waiting for me to look. I never saw the shape directly again, but every so often I'd catch a faint outline in the curtain's fabric, as though light from outside was hitting something tall that shouldn't be there. The final time it happened was the night before I moved out. I was packing boxes, trying hard not to glance at the covered window when I felt the air change behind me. A soft shift, almost like someone leaning close enough to disturb the warmth of the room. I turned slowly. The curtain bulged inward just slightly, as though a hand or a face were inches away from brushing against the fabric. The apartment was silent except for my own slow breathing. I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink for several seconds. Then, as gently as it had shifted, the curtain relaxed, falling flat again. I left the apartment that night. I didn't wait for morning. I packed what I could carry and drove to a motel across town, leaving the rest until daylight. When I returned the next afternoon, the window looked ordinary again, harmless, even. But the moment I stepped inside, I refused to look at it directly. I kept my gaze on the floor, moving quickly, grabbing boxes in tight handfuls until the place was empty. Now I live in a new building with thicker walls and windows that face the street instead of a courtyard. But even now, whenever I pass a window at night, I can't help checking the reflection, searching for the faintest suggestion of a face behind the glass. Because whatever I saw in that old apartment didn't feel like a passing shadow. It felt aware. And sometimes, when I'm up late and the house is a little too quiet, I get the strange sensation that if I turned my head quickly enough, I'd see that pale shape watching again, waiting patiently in the dark just beyond the glass. I used to think my house was the quietest place in the world after midnight. It's a small single-story place in a calm neighborhood, the kind where porch lights stay on all night and the only sounds you hear are sprinklers clicking on timers or the soft rumble of a distant car. My living room faces the backyard through a big sliding glass door, and most nights I'd sit on the couch with the TV low, letting the glow from the screen fill the room. The backyard always felt safe to me, fenced in, dimly lit by a single motion light above the patio. I never gave that door much thought. It was just there, a piece of glass separating me from the cool night air, nothing more. I didn't feel watched back then. I didn't feel anything at all. The first knock happened on a Tuesday around 1:30 a.m. It wasn't loud. It sounded like someone tapping their knuckle lightly against the glass. I paused the TV and waited, thinking maybe something had fallen or maybe the wind had pushed a branch against the door. It came again, soft, deliberate, 3 taps spaced apart just far enough to not be accidental. My heart kicked once, sharp and heavy. I turned toward the sliding door and saw only my own reflection staring back, the yard beyond still and untouched. The motion light hadn't activated, which made me feel a little better. Nothing moves back there without triggering it. I sat there for a moment, unsure if I wanted to get up or pretend I hadn't heard anything. The next night it happened again. Same sound, same softness, same patient rhythm. I muted the TV instantly this time, listening as my pulse filled my ears. The knocking came from the exact same spot on the glass just left of center, not too high, not too low. I stood slowly and walked toward the door, the carpet muffling my steps. When I got close enough to see only darkness outside and my own face faintly reflected in the glass, I hesitated. The yard looked so still it felt staged. As the motion light remained off, I pressed my palm lightly to the glass. It was cold, colder than it should have been. Nothing else happened, no movement, no noise, just stillness. By the third night, my unease had settled into something quieter but sharper. I stayed up later than usual, pretending to focus on my phone while the sliding door filled my peripheral vision. The room felt colder, though the thermostat was set normally. At around the same hour, the knocking came again, 3 taps, slow and soft. This time, the motion light flicked on immediately afterward, washing the patio in dim yellow. My breath caught as I leaned toward the glass. There were footprints. Bare, damp. Leading from the far end of the yard straight toward the door. They weren't there earlier. I hadn't noticed them when I brought the trash out. And what unsettled me most was that they looked fresh, like someone had just walked across the grass moments before the light came on. I didn't open the door. I backed away slowly, heart hammering, trying to convince myself some kid was messing around, or maybe an animal had stepped strangely enough to leave prints I mistook for human. But the shape was unmistakable: toes, arch-heeled, bare feet. I called a friend, kept him on the phone for a few minutes, though I didn't mention what happened. The prints were gone by morning, washed away by the sprinklers or absorbed into the cold ground. I tried to let it go. I really did. But it didn't stop. The knocking became a nightly pattern, always the same volume, always the same rhythm, always around the same time. Some nights it happened twice. Once it came in a cluster of irregular taps, like someone tapping their fingers idly across the glass while waiting. The motion light would sometimes flicker on for no reason, illuminating nothing but the empty yard. Other times it stayed completely dark even after I heard the knock. I began turning off every light in the house except the TV, thinking maybe I could catch a glimpse of whatever was outside if my reflection wasn't in the way. One night, around the 6th or 7th time it happened, I sat in total darkness except for the TV on mute. When the knock came, gentle, precise, like someone testing the glass, I didn't move. I let my eyes adjust, let the room settle. Then I slid silently off the couch and crouched low, watching the door from just below the frame. The motion light turned on after a pause that felt far too long. It illuminated nothing. Not a figure, not an animal, not even drifting leaves. But the glass had fogged slightly, forming a faint oval patch at the exact height and position where someone's face would be if they were leaning close enough to exhale against it. I stared at that oval, barely breathing, feeling my stomach twist cold. The fogged patch didn't fade right away. It lingered like the warmth had been real. The next morning, I checked the patio in daylight. I walked the entire yard, scanning the grass, the fence, the corners where shadows gathered. Everything looked normal, too normal. I started spending evenings at work or a friend's place just to avoid being home after midnight. But every time I returned, the house felt a little colder, like the air held something I couldn't see. Once I came home to find the motion light on even though it had never done that during the day before. The final night changed everything. I had decided to record the sliding door, setting my phone against a book aimed directly at the glass while I pretended to watch TV. The knocking came later than usual, nearly 3 a.m., but this time it was slightly louder, still soft, still controlled, but deliberate enough to make my blood pressure spike. I didn't move. I kept my eyes fixed on the door, heart pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. The motion light didn't turn on. Well, the yard stayed pitch black, but something moved. Not a shape, not a person. A shadow broader than a person's, taller than the doorframe, shifting in the darkness like it belonged to something standing just out of the light's reach. The knocking came again, this time accompanied by a soft scrape like fingertips dragging gently across the glass. I heard my breathing quicken. The shadow leaned forward, barely perceptible, but enough that I felt the temperature drop inside the room. I whispered for myself to move, to run, to call someone, but I was frozen. Then suddenly, the motion light flicked on. The patio was empty. Completely empty. No shadow, no footprints, no movement, nothing at all. The knocking stopped for good after that night. I moved out 2 weeks later, unable to sleep or relax or even sit in that house alone. When I finally got around to reviewing the video on my phone, most of it was darkness and the faint glow of the TV. But at the moment the motion light came on, the camera caught something I still wish I hadn't seen. A faint handprint on the outside of the glass, pressed flat at the exact spot where my head rested when I sat on the couch. It wasn't my hand, and it wasn't shaped quite right. Sometimes, when I sit near windows now, I catch myself listening for soft, patient tapping, the kind that sounds like someone standing inches away in the dark, waiting to be noticed. I used to think of my neighborhood as one of those quiet, unremarkable places where nothing truly strange ever happens. The kind of street lined with older houses, all slightly different in design, but sharing the same worn porches, the same leaning fences, the same yellow porch lights that flickered on at dusk and stayed lit until dawn. I moved there because I liked the silence at night, the slow hum of distant traffic, the soft sway of tree branches brushing against each other, the steady comfort that everything around me was still. My living room window faced the street, and most evenings I'd sit on the couch with a cup of tea, watching the houses across from mine fade into silhouettes as the sun slipped behind the roofs. It became a quiet ritual, something that made the place feel more like home. The house directly across from me was identical to mine in size, but always seemed dimmer somehow, like its windows absorbed light instead of reflecting it. I rarely saw anyone come or go from there. Occasionally a car in the driveway, sometimes groceries on the porch, but never a person carrying them. I figured they simply kept to themselves, maybe worked late hours, maybe traveled a lot. I didn't think much of it until one evening, as I turned off the lamp beside me, I noticed a faint shape in the window of the house across the street, a figure standing perfectly still. At first, I thought it was my own reflection layered oddly onto the glass, but when I leaned forward, the silhouette didn't change or distort. It stayed there, motionless, right behind the second-floor window of the house opposite mine. It didn't move for the rest of the night. I kept glancing up between sips of my tea, expecting it to shift or disappear, but it stayed rooted in the same spot like a dark cutout pasted against the faint glow behind the window. The figure had no clear features, nothing distinct enough to identify, and yet every time I looked at it, I felt a strange pressure settle behind my ribs, not fear exactly, but a growing awareness that I was being seen. When I finally went to bed, I told myself it was probably just a coat or a tall lamp placed near the window. Objects can play tricks on you after dark, but something about the stillness unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The next night the figure was there again. Same window, same posture, same steady presence. I tried to ignore it, pulling down the blinds earlier than usual, but I kept finding myself drawn back to the window like a quiet compulsion. Around midnight, I lifted the corner of the blind with 2 fingers, heart tapping lightly as I peered across the street. The figure hadn't moved an inch. If it was a person, they stood unnaturally still. No shifting weight, no turning, no adjusting posture. If it was an object, it was positioned with a strange intentionality, as though angled just slightly toward my window. By the fourth night, it became part of my routine. I'd glance up instinctively every few minutes to see if it was still there. It always was. I even considered knocking on their door during the day just to see who lived there, but something stopped me each time I approached my front steps. Maybe it was the odd emptiness of the house across the street or the unsettling thought that the figure was less about who lived there and more about what was watching. I told a friend about it over the phone, laughing lightly to hide my discomfort, but hearing the story aloud made my voice go tight. The friend suggested it was simply a mannequin or some kind of prop. I wanted to believe that. The first real jolt happened a week later. I came home later than usual, close to 2 in the morning, tired and cold from the walk from my car. As I stepped into the living room and turned on the lamp, the street outside was quiet and nearly empty. Out of habit, my eyes drifted to the house across the street and the figure was gone. The window was completely dark. For a moment, a wave of relief washed over me, like tension slowly uncoiling from my shoulders. I reached to set my keys on the table, and that's when something shifted in the corner of my vision. The figure was standing in a different window, the one on the first floor, closer to the street, much nearer to eye level. It wasn't just a shape this time. It had weight to it, presence, a broad, dark outline that seemed slightly hunched as if it had leaned down to look out. The positioning was unmistakably deliberate. A cold sensation spread down my arms and I backed away from the glass before I could stop myself. The figure did not move, didn't tilt its head, didn't turn away. It simply faced my window, still as stone. I closed the blinds immediately, trying to swallow the tightness in my throat. I slept with the bedroom door locked that night, though I couldn't explain why that made me feel any safer. Over the next several days, the figure moved. Not every night, not in a predictable pattern, but in ways that suggested intention rather than coincidence. One night it appeared in the upper right window. 2 nights later, it was back on the first floor, but closer to the corner, half hidden behind the curtain. Sometimes it wasn't there at all when I first looked, only to appear after I'd been sitting for a while, as though it waited for me to settle in before returning. Once when I checked right before dawn, the window was empty, but a faint dark shape seemed to stand behind the front door instead, like a shadow waiting inside. I started avoiding the living room altogether. I stopped watching TV at night, stopped sitting near windows, stopped lingering in any room that faced the street. I installed thicker blinds, though I never fully trusted them. Some nights I turned every light on in the house, trying to hold back the feeling that something across the street was quietly studying me through layers of glass and fabric. When I met neighbors during the day, I wanted to ask about the house, but every time the words reached the edge of my tongue, I swallowed them back. No one else seemed bothered by that house. No one ever mentioned seeing anyone inside. The breaking point came 2 weeks after the first sighting. It was just before dawn, the sky faintly blue at the edges when a soft sound woke me, the subtle, rhythmic creak of my front gate swinging open. I froze, listening, the back of my neck prickling. The gate never moved unless someone physically opened it. I slipped quietly out of bed, heart pounding in slow, heavy beats. My bedroom window faced the side of the house, not the street, so I had no view of the gate from there. I crept into the hallway, then into the living room, careful not to step too close to the blinds. I stood there for several long seconds, breath held, listening for footsteps or movement. The silence felt thick. Then, with a kind of dreadful hesitation, I lifted the edge of the blind just enough to see the street. The house across from mine was dark, but my gate was open, wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. And standing at the very edge of the sidewalk, facing my house directly, was the figure. No window now between us, no glass, just the street and a few feet of cold air. Its silhouette was sharper, taller, and even in the dim early light, I could see the faint tilt of its head as though it knew exactly where I stood. I dropped the blinds instantly and stepped back so quickly I nearly lost my footing. I called the police, voice shaking, but by the time they arrived 20 minutes later, the gate was closed again. The sidewalk empty. The house across the street silent. They checked the area, shining their flashlights along the street and into the overgrown shrubs beside my fence, but found nothing. They asked if I had imagined it, if maybe exhaustion had played tricks on me. I didn't bother arguing. Exhaustion didn't open gates. Fatigue didn't move silhouettes from window to sidewalk. I moved out within a week. I packed boxes in daylight, never once lifting the blinds in the living room again. When the moving truck pulled away from the curb, I couldn't bring myself to look back at the house across the street. I didn't want to know if the figure had returned to one of the windows to watch me leave. But even now, in my new place, sometimes I catch myself pausing before turning off a lamp, glancing toward the nearest window to make sure nothing stands behind the glass. And occasionally, late at night, when the street grows too quiet and the air feels still, I have the unsettling impression that someone across the way is looking in, patient and silent, waiting for the right moment to be seen again. Night has a way of showing us things we'd rather not see. When the streets grow quiet and the world pulls back into its corners, even familiar windows turn into uncertain mirrors. The stories tonight are reminders of how thin that barrier really is, just a sheet of glass separating comfort from the things that choose to watch in silence. It's unsettling how easily an ordinary moment can shift, how a simple glance toward the dark can make you aware of just how exposed we all are after sunset. And if you've ever felt that strange tug to close the curtains a little earlier or walk faster past your own reflection, you're not alone. Most people don't talk about the nights when they felt eyes on them, when a shape lingered too long behind the glass, when they realized the darkness on the other side wasn't empty the way they hoped. But hearing these stories, sharing these small pieces of fear, somehow makes the night feel less like something you face alone. You've sat through them quietly, the way one does when the truth is heavier than expected. As the night settles back into its stillness, take a moment before turning off the lights. Make sure the windows are closed the way you like them, the curtains drawn just enough to feel safe. And if you ever want to step back into these late-night confessions, you're welcome to return, subscribe, share these stories, or simply join me again when the world goes quiet. For now, rest if you can. The windows will stay where they are, patient and waiting, and the dark outside will do what it always does. I'll keep its secrets until morning.